Yeah, I think there's a strong desire on the part of the Ramaphosa administration to not be to not be pressed into a corner, but maybe they realize they're going to lose that access to the US soon if they don't do at least some of these diplomatic moves. And I don't know if it's going to be enough. We are seeing a stronger move in general by Western countries like the US, the UK, Australia, to try and counter some of the initiatives by countries like China and Russia to build infrastructure and to invest in places like Africa. So maybe for them, they're going to they won't see rhetoric and nice buzzwords as enough anymore to convince them to continue giving access to their markets through agreements like AGOA.
Okay, and in the studio with me is Chris Hattingh from the CRA, that's the Center for Risk Analysis. He's head of policy analysis. Well, Chris, you have these risk alerts that you hand out or that you publish every Monday. And one of the ones that particularly interests our viewers is the one on AGOA. That is what is the full name of AGOA? The Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which gives us privileged access to US markets. And you've said that South Africa is playing with fire. Why?
Hi, Linda. Thanks very much for having us on to discuss what we think is a very important issue in the global context of lower growth, tensions around things like protectionism, high tariffs. We think in that context where emerging markets like South Africa needs as many beneficial trade agreements with countries around the world, one risks losing access to those markets and those agreements if you take a particular foreign policy stance. Now, in this context, it is South Africa's proposed or professed neutrality on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, taking the stance of neutrality, but then still engaging in military exercises with Russia specifically. So one wonders, does the rhetoric match the actual intentions, the actions? In this context, we think there's concerns on the part of the US, highlighted by a few US congressmen in the last few months, about the AGOA agreement itself. So every country, we've got professions of quote unquote objective free trade. That being said, every country has its own requirements that it wants in terms of investments, in terms of preferential trade agreements, so strings attached. We, for example, look at Chinese investment in Africa. Those come with strings attached. Also for the US, they have agreements that they think countries should adhere to. Now, in the South African case, AGOA is up for renegotiation, as it were, re-engagement by 2025 in light of our foreign policy stance on the Russian invasion. Some in the US government are starting to ask whether it is right for them to give preferential access to South African goods, South African exports to the US market, which at this point in time remains the most advanced economy in the world, with low unemployment, high prospects for growth in the future if they come out of the sort of low growth environment at the moment.
Well, it seems that the Ramaphosa government is aware that there's risk associated, and they sent Sidney Mufamadi, the National Security Advisor in the Presidency. So what do you think he told them, and what did they get out of the meeting?
If one looks at the sort of core characteristics up until this point in time of the Ramaphosa administration, perhaps the buzzwords of social compacts, of getting everyone around a table, of inclusive growth, of investment summits, these buzzwords might have been used. I wouldn't want to put words in Mr. Mufamadi's mouth, but I think that sort of general feeling of, South Africa is in the place of wanting the conflict to be resolved in Ukraine, but it thinks it should be done through certain channels in certain ways. It doesn't think that it should take a stance, a quote-unquote clear stance on the world stage, but it very much values the relationship that it has with the US. And one shouldn't discount that if you look at the basic numbers in terms of South Africa's trade with the US on the one hand versus with Russia. This isn't to say that you necessarily, in economic terms, sort of utilitarian terms, you weigh it up in terms of just pure economics. Of course, there's moral considerations and that sort of thing, but by far the majority of value that we get is with access to US markets versus Russia. Now, in the last sort of 12 months or so, given the Russian invasion, there is opportunity for even more South African exports to other places. For example, in terms of raw materials, we could benefit even more from that, exporting to places like the US and also Europe. Europe, of course, under a lot of strain now in terms of losing access to Russian gas, Russian oil, all those sorts of basic energy needs. So I think Mr. Mufamadi would have gone with the intention to say, this is where we are. We've got perhaps he would even touch on the historical relationship between the current government and Russia. Not to downplay that, but that might be very important from the sort of rhetoric, moral standpoint for them. But on the other hand, he would say they very much view the US as a friend, the US's involvement in South African democracy, in sub-Saharan Africa. So they would want, I guess, the best of both worlds. And it remains to be seen if you can have your cake and eat it too, if your bread can be buttered on both sides. If you'll allow me to use all the analogies and metaphors in one sentence, yeah, I think there's a strong desire on the part of the Ramaphosa administration to not be caught between, to not be pressed into a corner, but maybe they realize they're going to lose that access to the US soon if they don't do at least some of these diplomatic moves. And I don't know if it's going to be enough. We are seeing a stronger move in general by Western countries like the US, the UK, Australia, to try and counter some of the initiatives by countries like China and Russia to build infrastructure and to invest in places like Africa. So maybe for them, they're going to draw, they won't see rhetoric and nice buzzwords as enough anymore to convince them to continue giving access to their markets through agreements like AGOA.
Yeah, I was trying to get comment from the embassy in South Africa, from the US embassy, and they didn't want to say anything now. But the big question is, how this is going to play out. Because just after BRICS, there is this conference at the AGOA that the US senators and congressmen would come to South Africa. And the question is, would they all come if Putin does come for the BRICS summit? So, there's a lot at play here, and you think there's enough awareness from the South African government that this could all go wrong.
Right, and I think this is where the sort of rubber meets the road. So you've got the rhetoric of where you say you're neutral and all that sort of stuff. That's all well and good. But if you realize that means maybe you lose access to advanced technology or advanced investment or skills development or education opportunities, those things that South Africa so desperately needs that you would get over the longer term in something like a preferential trade agreement with a country like the US, those tangibles are going to start to be lost. So I think the current government, maybe there are some within the cabinet, within the National Executive Committee, who are realizing just how serious the situation could become. I'm not saying that I think all of them do. I very much think there's still the commitment to the quote-unquote ideals and the rhetoric of the struggle and the revolution, and that means that you don't get into bed with imperialist forces, as it were. Not one imperialist force that invades another country, but, Western imperialist forces. So, I think South Africa finds itself in a very tricky position. The government realizes it needs to encourage foreign investment flows into the country. I think as of 2021, our gross fixed capital formation, the percentage of that to GDP was 13%, the lowest point it's been in the last 10 to 15 years. Without that sort of thing, you don't get substantive business formation, substantive job creation, just substantive growth, that the kind that we need. And you need that from as many sources as possible. You won't necessarily get it from a country like Russia, which is slowly but surely being not strangled. It has performed well in the sanctions, but it's not investing to the level that a country like the US and US companies would be able to. So if your concern is getting investment into your country from as many sources as possible, you don't, take this particular road, I think.
And you're talking about this particular road, and trade with the US is worth far more to us than to Russia. Can you just look at that a little bit at the figures, what kind of exports we have to the US, and also which industries would be affected?
I think just on that last point, the sort of main ones that jump to mind, the automobile industry, given South Africa's skills there, our manufacturing, but even there we are dallying with things like implementing a policy on electric vehicles, and there we will have potentially lose access to European markets, given I think they likely will ban the imports of internal combustion engines at some point. So we're not really upping our game there. So the automobile industry, the mining industry, also agriculture. Agriculture being arguably one of the few light points in the South African economic landscape. How strong agriculture continues to perform. Citrus, poultry, those sorts of things that we export to the US and that we might lose. Wine. I mean, that's a big job creator in the country, the sort of tourism, but even then the intangible. So if you lose AGOA, if it's not extended, it steadily leads to a breakdown in those sorts of potential relationships. And then you start to see maybe US tourists, you'll see a decline in that number and they don't come spend as much money as they did before. Again, how does that impact local industry? If you really are concerned about job creation, transformation, all these easy buzzwords, if you don't have money coming in, none of that stuff can really take place. In terms of the hard numbers, if we look at the US, for example, the value of our exports to the US in 2022 measured $10.7 billion, and that was roughly 38 times more than our exports to Russia, which were $282.85 million. So you can just see the vast scope in terms of difference. Again, if one wants to play the pragmatic game, that doesn't mean that you don't find opportunities for different ways to trade and to export, but you need to be very careful in terms of what you open yourself up to. So let's assume the best case scenario, we continue to trade with Russia and then we lose access to AGOA. Maybe the worst case scenario is if we continue to trade and export and do all sorts of different agreements and friendships and military exercises with Russia, maybe then we expose ourselves to sanctions that the US has imposed on Russia. You lose access to international banking systems, for example. Russia now, they're situated very geographically and I guess ideologically in different ways close to China. So they've got a very big market there that has helped them now during this time of the sanctions. South Africa doesn't have that sort of, fallback, as it were, if we were cut off from global trade and global financial flow. So we need to proceed, I think, incredibly carefully.
Well, and already Mr. Ramaphosa wasn't invited to the G7 meeting in Japan. Is that an indication of a lesser role for South Africa on the international stage if we continue on this path of drifting towards China and Russia?
I think at the very least it indicates serious concern on the part of G7 countries who are ideologically sort of Western. So normally when one thinks of the West, you think of the US and the UK. But in this case, countries like Japan, maybe India also steadily along that sort of similar path. You look at how India might play a role now in the geopolitics in terms of Russia and China right there as its next door neighbors. South Africa, I think, of course, after 1994 enjoyed a lot of diplomatic and moral heft, given the end of apartheid and that sort of diplomatic weight, how we managed the transition, all that sort of stuff. But that is steadily being whittled away. So you say you're committed to things like, liberal democracy, individual rights, freedom of the press, but then your actions show that you aren't willing to at least to condemn acts of war, for example. You're strong on the Palestine issue, and rightly so, but then you aren't strong on something like the Russian invasion. So that inconsistency starts to whittle away at your moral high ground that you enjoyed before. And I mean, there will be different interpretations, maybe that President Ramaphosa now wasn't invited and that I believe the chair of the African Union instead. But if you're given the country's history and the country's weight that it's enjoyed the last 20 to 30 years in terms of the global stage, you really have to ask then, in that context, does this mean now, slowly but surely, it is being whittled away? Maybe not overnight, but you chip away at that relationship that you had before. And again, maybe the US decides preferential trade agreements are better for other emerging markets. Maybe they decide that's better for them going forward, and we lose again that opportunity, that access for that opportunity for exporting. Ultimately, of course, it impacts on the fiscus. And given how tight the fiscus is at the moment, the debt to GDP ratio, the low fixed capital investment, is this really the most prudent path to be taking?
When in your report, you headed it with a header, playing with fire. So you think South Africa is playing with fire?
Yeah, absolutely. And mostly that's because what I mentioned earlier with the global environment of tighter credit conditions, stickier inflation than we saw before. Those more developed economies that do have access to deeper capital markets, higher levels of potential investment, they're going to start to question, should they continue to have these relationships and agreements with a country like South Africa? Why not take their exposure to risk somewhere else, maybe to India again or Brazil, maybe prefer those locales for their investment, for giving preferential access to exports and all that sort of stuff. So for the benefits that we could get, I think, and that we continue to enjoy, given our very difficult economic situation, I think we're sticking our head in the oven maybe when we don't particularly need to.
Well, Chris Hattingh from the Centre for Risk Analysis, thanks for speaking to us.
Thank you so much.